Well, I guess we can get started. So, this is episode 4 of Unboxed Healing. So, welcome everybody. My name is Lindsay Acker. I am an LCSW. I'm based in New Jersey. And my background spans over a decade, hospital, community healthcare, private practice, and then on the mental health tech side, ketamine assisted therapy. That's where Meredith and my path had crossed. And we decided that we wanted to start this podcast to really talk about healing and therapy in a depathologizing way and not in a box, hence unboxed healing. So that's why we're here. I'll let Meredith introduce herself, and then our guest speaker today, Michael Anthony, will start the show.
Hi, everybody. I'm Meredith. I'm also based in New Jersey. I am licensed in 5 states, so most of my work is remote. I do have a small in-person practice here. But yeah, kind of same as Lindsay, you went from kind of more in the box, right? But what we're taught as therapists in school is like the right way of doing therapy. And um, over time in my experience as a client has really informed my experience as a therapist and really just expanded into some alternative and brain body modalities of healing that I guess some would consider outside of the box. So that's what we like to talk about here. And I'm excited to be here with Michael today. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and honored that it's episode 4. It's awesome that you guys are just starting this out, and I really think it's important to create these spaces for everybody to learn and understand and have open conversations. So I'm really excited to be here, especially to talk about the importance of men's mental health. I don't think mental health itself has to be gendered, but especially when it comes to interventions, that's kind of where paths divert a little bit. So myself, I'm an LCSW, currently in private practice. I'm visiting here from the Integrative Counsel office. But I started, I think I have over like 15 years of experience in the mental health field, between working through group homes, child safety, community-based mental health, but really made the jump to private practice about 4 years ago at this point. I do things such as EMDR therapy, just individual talk therapy, ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And I always found it interesting. People always ask when you first start out, what do you want your specialization to be, right? And it's always a hard question to answer. But what's interesting is I find that the more you get out there and the more you practice, it naturally kind of funnels down. And I found myself in a space where I work primarily with individual males, which is great. As of right now, just to dive a little bit in, starting off, currently only 1/3 of the population of people that are in therapy are males, yet according to the CDC in 2024, they make up like 70% of the suicide rate. So there is a very big gap between people out there, men out there specifically, that need mental health interventions, but are too afraid to do so due to things such as stigmatization, how we've been raised historically, media portrayals. There's a lot of information that can go out there, but before I really start, I want to give a quick shout out. I see that my mom is here, and today is her birthday. So happy birthday, Mom. Thank you so much for all the support. I think I saw her twin brother here earlier, Larry, and happy birthday to him as well. So just wanted to get that out there to start out. But yes, very excited to be here. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. We're excited too. I think, like you said, this is a really important topic, and it always has been, but I especially think in the world that we live in today, even more so. So, I guess to get started, maybe we can talk a little bit about how did we even get here, right? How did
Yeah.
we get to kind of to your point, men needing mental health help because of the high rates of suicide and other, other contributing factors and comorbidities and things like that, and really understanding the history and how that kind of shaped the view. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of this, has started from generations ago. Ultimately, I think that, especially starting in eras such as World War II, Great Depression era, things along those lines, there was more of a survival mindset rather than a mindful mindset. A lot of the stories that I hear, myself included, growing up, the message was, man up, right? It's a put your emotions aside for the greater good, right? Be the protector, be the provider, be the person that kind of maintains, right? But along the lines, we lose that aspect of what's really going on internally, right? You see a lot of anger issues, but like we say in the field, anger is a secondary emotion. So what's going on underneath? What are we not talking about? What are we not processing? And so, because of the stigmatization, especially around finding mental health services and being seen as a weakness, a lot of males don't want to feel that weakness. That goes against their programming, right? The programming is survive, provide, rather than be mindful and actually understand what's going on underneath, which can be really strengthening when we take the extra time to understand what is going on underneath. On top of that, we look at Robert Bly had a really good book called Iron John, and he made it a very interesting observation about how traditional cultures used to have these transition rituals, right, to teach boys how to become men. And a lot of that came into play with, mindfulness practices, things along those lines. But somewhere around 1940s, 1950s, we really started to glorify the absent father, right? The one that was always at work, the one that would just come home at the end of the day. In media, sometimes like the Dick Van Dyke Show, right? Seen as like the bumbling idiot in a way, right? Just kind of the idea of the removed father that comes back just to provide, right? And that plays into the survival mindset. Going further than that, current aspects, right? You think of the lone hero, James Bond, Batman, right? You never have the scenes of Batman going to therapy and talking about how he was really afraid that the Joker was going to win, right? Or something along those lines, right? So there hasn't really been any sort of portrayal out there of individuals, specifically males, that are getting in touch with the emotions that are going on underneath. So again, just to reiterate, I think that we've been operating off of a survival mindset rather than a mindful mindset. And I think that's something that really needs to change. And I feel passionate about trying to reduce that stigma and understand that counseling and mental health services doesn't have to be a reaction thing where things are just at crisis mode and there needs to be intervention right now. It can definitely be a proactive thing. And there's a lot of strength in that.
So what you're saying is men have feelings too.
Definitely. We definitely have feelings too, regardless of whether or not we're talking about it openly.
I love that. When you were going through the history, it made me think of, I don't know if anybody here, anybody watching has seen the show Mad Men. It's one of my favorite shows ever, but it's, based in the early 60s through the end of, early 70s. And it really shows, like you said, like that history of men suppressing their emotions and their feelings and what then happens to their worlds because of not seeking the help that they need. So that's just where my mind went. But
It's
when
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I've only seen a couple episodes of Mad Men, so I'm just going off of people's reviews on that. But I think they say that Don Draper is, kind of the quintessential narcissist individual, right? And when you work with people, specifically with, things like narcissism, it's really about a self-esteem issue. As soon as that door starts to creak open, it's deflection and defensiveness and just pivoting, right? Manipulation,
yeah.
things along those
Well,
lines. So.
you start to learn through the series all about his childhood and his formative years and his time in the army and what and why he kind of became the person that he did become and
Mhm.
how all of those things leading up to him being this very successful person and also how that played into his success but then not going to give away anything but the ultimate like epiphanies that come throughout the season which I think is a great again I don't know why I'm endorsing the show so much I love it I've seen it's like one of my favorites but I think in the terms of a history lesson it really follows that path.
Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned that too. I think that it's really refreshing to see that some media is transitioning a little bit into that. Actually, my wife and I started finally watching The Sopranos recently, and that's a great example of just kind of the top of the mob, if you will, coming in to actually start understanding what his emotions are underneath, and maybe where some of his trauma comes from, and things like that. So really interesting dynamic, and at least refreshing to see that there are some companies out there, media companies out there that are starting to tap into that aspect.
Yeah. So in terms of um breaking the stigma, we talk a lot about stigma and that in general, just mental health overarchingly, right? I would
Mhm.
say there's less of a potentially less of a stigma today because of social media and all of the, especially since COVID, right?
Mhm. Definitely.
People talking about it more, getting online and seeing who is actually talking about it. But I think you're right when it comes to men, there's still this innate kind of primal, um, and I don't want to use the word inability, but maybe unawareness that it's okay to seek help. So how do you, as, one therapist, in your one area kind of help break that stigma and open the conversation?
I really think that one of the most important pieces of being an effective counselor is building the therapeutic alliance and building the therapeutic rapport, right? Of course, being a male as well, it's a little bit easier to start breaking down those walls with normalization. Again, really understanding that, I've had similar experiences as well, right? We didn't really have the training to understand what an emotion is, how to name it, how to understand it, and things along those lines. So I really spend a lot of time, for the first couple sessions to really build that alliance. A lot of the men that I see, it's their first time doing therapy, or their partner tells them they need therapy, right? Or they don't know why they're there, right? Things along those lines, right? But to really just start to normalize it, and again, take it from a reactive thing into a proactive thing is really helpful. But again, I mean, you think about probably the hardest part of therapy is coming in the door for the first time when you don't know what to expect. So to move from the idea that it needs to be such a rigid, cause effect kind of thing, and turning it more into a conversational approach and being able to relate with an individual really starts to let the guard down a little bit. I usually, one of my favorite things is somebody coming in very standoffish, not knowing why they're there, and then leaving very excited to come back. I think it's a really powerful thing, very rewarding, for me as a provider as well.
Totally. Yeah, and you touched on something that I've been noticing as a theme in these episodes we've been doing is that part of depathologizing and thinking outside of the box, it's like being a human therapist, right? It's like letting
Right.
some of your story and your experience into the space. And
Hmm.
that's kind of a shift away, at least from when I was in school, where it was like if a client asks you how you're feeling, you ask them, but why is that important to you? Like just
Right,
think back.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, I
really
think.
nice that
Mhm.
we're in this place where we can be human too.
Oh, I agree, Meredith. I think that it's really interesting when you think of like the guidelines and the boundaries that were taught to us in school and historically, things like that don't necessarily match up 100% with the climate that we need these days, right? So a little bit of self-disclosure, I don't mind. I tell clients I'm an open book. They can ask whatever they want, right? And of course, I still have boundaries when it comes to that. I'm not giving out an address or anything along those lines, right? But at the same time, you can relate to people's stories and in a way that helps them feel a little bit more comfortable with it as well. So I mean, even just it's kind of a funny anecdote, but even the way that we present ourselves, right? When I first started doing therapy, I was the always the button ups and the tucked in pants and everything like that, and completely by accident, my wife and I were moving, and I had accidentally packed away all of my work clothes. So I had to show up in a t-shirt and jeans one day. And I actually got the feedback, this actually makes you feel a lot more approachable to be relaxed. So now I just wear some sweaters and, some casual things. But again, really anything that we can do to really understand that we're humans having a human conversation. There doesn't need to be a power dynamic of me being a provider and you being a client, right? We can make it fun. We can make it conversational. We can joke around if you want to, right? Whatever's going to make you feel as comfortable as possible in order to really begin to build that relationship and understand it's okay is a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, I like that anecdote because again, bringing that back to like the history, you think of the shrink, you think of as Tony Soprano calls it.
Yep, exactly.
You think of, this very buttoned up professional who has no emotions themselves, and they're pathologizing you. They're diagnosing you. They're looking for, why are you this way? Instead of being their ally and building that rapport of getting to a place at their pace, essentially.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's men, women, or whatnot. But I like that story because I think more and more, at least I'm seeing more and more therapists are being more casual in the way that they dress, to show up in self-disclosure. And I think that's important. Yeah, I think that's a great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And to piggyback a little bit off of how we kind of started on this, when you're talking about social media and people being more expressive about mental health itself, I think, again, it is really refreshing to see more and more, specifically males, engaging in these services, making it more accessible, reducing some of the stigma, like you said, the shrink idea, things along those lines, you know. So, I mean, I'm seeing more and more come in, which I think is fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
so I'm curious, what are you seeing now at this point as being one of the biggest barriers to
Mhm.
men coming in?
It's a lot of stress, ultimately. I mean, you bring up the idea of COVID, where the world shut down, and now it's an idea of people trying to get back out there. It's a lot of stress management, anger management, life transition. And just kind of understanding. Again, I think one of the big ones is how we express anger, right? How we express the stress that's going on underneath. It's a very demanding world for anybody out there, right? But especially if you've been instilled with the survival mentality, it can add just an extra layer to that, right? I was just having a conversation just last night with a friend of mine who was talking about went through a very traumatic event with his wife and mentioned how his mentality was, I need to make sure she's okay before I start doing things, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can be in tandem, right? And I think that, that can really strengthen a relationship to understand that you're going through things together, right? So I would say a lot of it is, and I mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, sometimes it's counseling is seen as reactive, right? So I'm at the end of my wits. I don't know what else to do, right? I'm coming in crisis. Please help me. My relationships are deteriorating. My anger's getting out of control, right? So I see a lot of these individuals, at least now, in that reactive state, right? And so again, going back to the therapeutic rapport, very, very important to normalize things along those lines, right? But I'm really hoping that through reducing the stigma, again, we can get to more of a proactive space rather than a reactive space.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And you bringing up relationships and couples, and whether it's romantic or platonic relationships. I also was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, and we were talking about, again, some self-disclosure, how both of our partners are very communicative. And also, yes, they have that innate kind of provider feel, but they're also very much like need the recognition of thank you so much, like from the partner, thank you so much for doing that for me, that was really helpful. Or be for them to be validated in their feelings, and when they get frustrated or upset, for the partner to be able to say, um what is it that you're experiencing? And I think for a lot of times, because of that stigma, men are like your friend that was saying, I have to be strong for her. I have to, do that. And the reality is if you're a couple, you can't be here and here. You have to, and sometimes that's going to happen in relationships, because sometimes somebody's going to have to take the load when the other one kind of doesn't have the capacity for that, but it should be in tandem. And I think it's important, you know, and it kind of brings us to that next point. Like, it's not seen as a weakness. It's actually, because I think sometimes maybe the view is, oh, if I go to therapy, that takes away my masculinity. There's that kind of
Right.
stigma around it. But the
Mhm.
reality is, however you want to uh, address masculinity, or however you want to, define that, masculinity is being in touch with who you are and understanding who you are and how to be that version of yourself you want to be.
Mhm.
And if all of the things in your life aren't allowing you to be that, then you got to look into it.
Definitely. I think that the mindful male can definitely draw a lot of strength and understand why they operate the way that they do, rather than seeing it as a series of reactions and waiting until it gets to that point to really understand how your mind, body connection, everything works, right? And giving yourself the space to process and understand can actually just add to your strength as the provider, as the, as the nurturer, as things along those lines. And Lindsay, I love what you're talking about, right? Just kind of going off to it, doing things in tandem, increasing the communication, right? When I work with couples, one of the main things that I run into is a mismatch of empathy, not understanding what empathy even is, right? Going from more logical, state rather than emotional state. Oh, well, here's your problem, here's your answer, right? But that's not necessarily what we're always looking for. Sometimes we're really looking for that sense of connection that we have and really trying to process things together. Sounding boards, right? Things along those lines. I always ask clients, what's your support group look like, right? Do you have friends, right? And everybody says, oh yeah, I've got plenty of friends. I can go to anybody I want whenever I want to. But then I always challenge and ask, well, when was the last time you did it, right? It's like, well, I don't want to bother them. They got their own stuff going on. I was like, well, then are they actually friends, right? Like how are you utilizing these individuals in your life in order to support you, right? And sometimes people struggle with being able to answer that.
That's so interesting. I'm just thinking about that when you think about also like female friendships and male
Mhm.
friendships. Um, you know, it's like we get all the details as females and we know like, uh what the friend does for a living, their everyday, what they're feeling on this day. And then, the partner who's a male goes out with friends. Oh, what did you guys do? Oh, oh, he has a new girlfriend. Oh, what do they do? I don't know. It's like one
Yep.
of
Hmm,
those.
hmm, hmm.
So that's funny.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where my mind went to. Just that idea of, like, oh, well, what happened in their relationship? I don't know. We didn't talk about it, right? We just went back to watching the game, something along those lines, right?
It's so interesting listening to you guys talk about this because I'm married to a woman, so like being in the queer community, my experience is just so different from this. But it really also does lend itself to like why, right? It doesn't have to be that way. It could be more communication and empathy, and not to say that, like you said in the beginning, that it's necessarily gendered, but so much of our programming, as you said, right, and our conditioning and what we learn culturally and the media and peers. And I'm seeing it even, I have a 5-year-old son, and even, he comes home, even at 5 years old, saying like, no, the girls don't do this, boys do this. So, right, he's learning from his peers. He has two moms, and he's learning from his peers at such a young age. Like, no, this is what boys do. And like, we're not teaching him that. So some of this, it's got me thinking about how important it is, like really starting like planting those seeds young of like, well, I mean, I'm a therapist, so I have feelings wheel pillow, so the kid knows his feelings, so that's good.
Yeah, yeah.
But right,
But
starting young, like the messaging, so important.
definitely, and I'm seeing that a little bit more and more too. And my brother is doing that with his son right now, and I've had a couple of people that I've worked with that are starting to do that with their sons as well, which I think is fantastic. And it's funny that you bring up the feelings wheel. So it's probably like my main go-to tool, that I use, especially working with people that haven't had the emotional training to understand what emotions are, right? When you look at the feelings wheel, right, you start in the center there, right, with all of the umbrella emotions, and then really try to dig it down even further, because anybody can recognize happy, sad, angry, fearful, right? But it takes the extra practice to drill that down to loneliness, overwhelmed, things along those lines. So I think that really, really powerful tool. I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to find a way to sneak that in here somewhere. That's definitely probably my main go-to.
Yeah, and I loved Meredith. Your perspective is very interesting because you do have that different perspective. So you don't live that kind of dynamic, every day. Even though you have male clients and you have a son and all of that, but it is interesting. And one of the things too that we see a lot. I don't know if Michael, you see this. Um, on social media or even clients that you work with, but you see this trope a lot of, these men who, are emotionally available and, put the gas in the car and come home with the coffee and put the kids to bed and let mom sleep in and or let dad sleep in and it's then you see the comments of like there's men like this, there's still men out there like that, and that is a much broader conversation of like, well, why wouldn't there be? And
Right.
let's talk about it. So Meredith, that kind of when you brought that up about, your partner is a woman,
Mhm.
it's and not again, not to say that, a woman can't not do those things either, but it's just this trope of like men don't have the capacity to be compassionate, to be empathetic, to think before, and they do. It's just a lot of times it's not taught or in school or the shows they're watching. And so I just think that's all interesting. I don't know if you see that in your practice.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, I think it all comes back down to a practice of vulnerability, right? It takes vulnerability to look at yourself and also open up to others, right? And so when we haven't had that programming or we haven't had that practice, it's really hard to tap into and understand, especially later in life, right? That's why I love Meredith, what you're talking about, really identifying and working with, children when they're young to really start putting in those building blocks. Because again, Lindsay, like you said, you can be that person. You can be the person that's in tune. You can be the person that, is more emotionally open, which can be even more attractive. Pairing back to what we mentioned earlier, right? Being able to really understand your inner workings can provide a level of strength and emotional intuition that people do find people are attracted to, right? Just in general. I like to say that when you really are in tune with yourself, that's the energy that attracts the people to you. Rather than going out there and searching for the friends and searching for the partnerships and searching for things that might be the equivalent of putting a square peg in a round hole, right? It just doesn't fit. When you really take that time to really understand yourself, that's the energy that gets put out there that has other people become attracted to you in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, So, kind of the next point that we have here, and the next
Mhm.
kind of pillar of this podcast is, and we've talked about it, but maybe we can go into more detail of
Sure.
why does men's mental health matter, right? We talk about mental health in general, and people will be like, "Oh, why do you have to gender it?" Kind of what we said, but why does it matter? And kind of what's your take on that, and how, on a macro level, do you
Mhm.
feel like we can um, kind of start breaking down the stigma and also educating?
Yeah, it's really about the conversations that you have. A lot of people ask, like, hey, how are you doing today? And we're expecting, just kind of a surface level answer. But to ask somebody, how are you really doing? And be prepared to have that conversation can really start to open up some of those doors. Again, as I started to say in the beginning, right, there's only a third of the population seeking mental health counseling are males, but they still make up like 70% of the suicide rate. And what that shows us on top of that as well is increased rates of substance use, homelessness, incarceration, right? And it just tells us that there's a lot of people out there using poor coping skills because they just don't have the wherewithal or the knowledge to find other ways to be able to cope with some of the underlying emotions. Think about self-medication, turning to drugs and alcohol, right? Turning to crimes. Going back to some of the things that were in the book Iron John I was mentioning, going off of the absent father, right? We start to look at, well, who can we pull the lessons from, right? And Meredith, I think you did a really great job of mentioning as well as looking at peers, right? But what happens if the peers in your neighborhood are, say, gang members, right? Or people that are in the rough crowd, if you will, right? That's ultimately where you start to pull your lessons from, right? That's where you start to pull your coping skills from. That's where you start to find your community, right? And without that extra intervention of being able to, say, engage in mental health services and counseling and things along those lines, that can just exacerbate the problem, right? Lead to your own incarcerations, again, leading to the substance use, leading to the homelessness, leading to the increased suicide rate. We're humans, we all have limits, right? Unfortunately, a lot of males are reaching those limits without doing anything prior. So again, I think one of the first steps is to really normalize that aspect that strength can come from mindfulness, right? Vulnerability doesn't have to be a scary thing. Counseling doesn't mean that you're weak, right? Again, going proactive rather than reactive. Right? I think all of that is really important. And I think outside of the office, it's important for us to really engage and have those conversations, really encourage the vulnerability and ask, how are you really doing today, rather than just how was your day, right? Instead of asking, like, hey, how was work today, right? Asking, how did work make you feel today, right? Like, what was going on there, right? Tell me something a little bit more about what maybe stressed you out, right? Maybe upset you, right? Tell me about the work meeting that you came out feeling insecure, right? Just really starting up and encouraging those conversations, just even offline, can really help out.
Yeah, and something that this is bringing up for me is, and it really fits this theme of depathologizing and unboxed healing, is that folks experience emotions, events, right, differently. And that's across the gender spectrum, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be gender specific, but even two men can experience anger very differently, right? Because one might be
Oh, yeah.
coming from fear and one might be coming from depression, right?
Hmm.
So I think that part of this is also really goes back to this larger theme of treating the individual and like not putting people into boxes. Like even I'm imagining like in an anger management group, actually one of the in early in my career, I facilitated a men's group at an addictions treatment center and really like everyone was kind of there for the same substance, but the stuff underneath, right? The feelings or the experiences underneath were so vast,
Hmm.
So I think that, also what you're talking about, it's like getting to know that individual and not assuming that, just because of your gender that your experience is the same either.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that's another really important piece, especially going off of the question of how do we really start having these conversations in the therapeutic setting, is really understanding that, again, like you said, Meredith, no two people are the same. Everybody has their own equation. I really like to stress that as well when I start to meet with people is say, like, hey, what worked for you isn't going to work for my 2 o'clock, right? What worked for you isn't going to work for my 11 o'clock, right? You have your own equation, right? And through this process, we'll figure out what that equation is, right? Because you're right, people experience anger differently. Some people might fight, some people might flight, right? You talk about that fight, flight, or freeze response. That's why a lot of the interventions that I use, I mean, they range from traditional just talk therapy, solution focused therapy, all the way into, more in-depth things, EMDR, ketamine assisted psychotherapy, right? Really reprogramming some of those underlying beliefs, right? Because you're right, it all activates the same kind of nervous system, the same kind of responses. It just manifests differently according to each individual.
Yeah, because when you look at therapy, I think both of your points are so true. Because when you look at therapy as a whole, male, female, non-binary, trans, however you identify, human emotions are human emotions.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter who you are. And so I think as the therapist, like Meredith is saying, you 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 do have to, yes, you have to take into account things that are just natural, but you also have to take into account, like Meredith said, the individual and um what kind of, I think again we always talk about in these again, this is the fourth one, but like really be starting where, like, we always learn where the client is, but like actually really doing that
Mm-hmm.
and really not just having them come in, okay, what's your background, what happened to you when you were growing up, okay, what's, trying to find the trauma in the first couple of sessions, but really just like in this moment, what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can kind of work backwards a little bit, I think, and me and Meredith, we've talked about that a lot, because I think too, therapy can be scary for a lot of people, but men too, because I'm going to have to divulge my whole story. I'm going to have to tell you these things that I don't want to. There's shame and guilt and fear, yes, in all humans, but that's a barrier. So being able to also educate men that it's not scary. It's actually a safe space, and there is no judgment. And I
Mhm.
think those words and kind of going back to the feelings wheel,
Yep.
to kind of go back and then go back to childhood. I see a comment here, and I think it's actually really important. This person says, why men are more mission driven, right? That's the stigma that we have, or the biology that we think of. And so, you know, emotions can be an impediment to the outcome or success, or what's needed. And then you look at women or girls, and it's like you have too many emotions. And so, if we can somehow allow men and women's feelings to just be neutral,
Mhm. Mhm.
I think is important in the teaching.
Well, definitely. And that's why I think normalization is key, right? And I think you brought up a really interesting point, is you're trying to train the mindful male. It's also important to be the mindful counselor, right? I think that we do get caught up in efficiency. What do you want? How do we get there? Where's the trauma? Where's the childhood? All that stuff, right? But again, everybody's situation is unique. But at the same time, if you're coming in, sometimes you think you're the only one that's experiencing it, right? I'm the only one that I know that is manifesting in anger in this way because I haven't talked to anybody else about it, right? Well, guess what? A lot of people underdo that, right? And again, it's no difference between gender orientation, things along those lines. We all manifest emotion in similar ways, right? It's just a matter of figuring out that you're not the only one experiencing this, right? Emotions are emotions. We just have to understand how they're manifesting to you and why, where they're coming from. But that does take some time, right? It's not a one session thing, it's a multiple session thing. And it really starts by reducing that uncomfortability that can come from understanding, okay, I'm finally here, right? There's something that's going on that I need to discuss, right? But how am I supposed to trust this person that I've just met for the first time? I have no idea what therapy is all about. And you're right, I'm going to have to open up. So, what does that take to really encourage somebody to open up? It's not coming from the rigid therapist. It's not coming from the very direct treatment modalities, start, finish, in between. It really starts to become mindful for yourself as a provider to humanize yourself, right? And normalize and relate. Right? We all have something in common with one another. It just takes a little bit of effort to find what that is. I find that it's a really, really good starting point. When you can find that piece that you have in common with somebody, it really starts to open up a lot of doors of communication.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the comment here about mission driven, it touches on aka veterans. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit specifically to this population, right? Veterans, law enforcement, first responders. I think there's like an added layer of stigma there. So I'm not sure if you have anything to add about that, like extra layer there.
Yeah, I find it really challenging in order to get, like first responders, veterans, things along those lines, engaged in therapy. It's a pathway that I really want to focus a lot of this work on, is to really reduce the stigma around that as well. Because I mean, the suicide rate for veterans specifically is outrageous, right? Forgive me, I don't remember the number, but it's a pretty exorbitant amount per day, right? And it's a lot of people dealing with traumas. It's a lot of people dealing with instances, but very mission driven, like you said. I actually had, this brings up a really interesting situation that I had not too long ago. I was doing a lecture at USF and had brought up the idea of EMDR and discussed that a little bit. And afterwards, it was really powerful. Somebody approached me and mentioned that EMDR saved his life. It turned out he was special forces over in the Middle East. They had an EMDR specialist come in to work with their unit, and as you would expect, the whole idea was the response was, "I don't want to do this. I don't need to worry about it. Right? I'm good. Right? Like this isn't bothering me." Right? But they had to go through it. And he said afterwards it was so life changing because it got to the point where he can recognize the things that he went through, but it doesn't hold power over him anymore. It's almost as if he took those experiences, polished them off, and put them on a shelf and recognized that he can experience emotion, but it doesn't have to be the emotion, right? But again, to answer your question, when it comes to engaging these individuals, it is difficult to do so. again, I know I'm throwing a lot of anecdotes in, but ran into an officer recently, a police officer, and he mentioned how his intervention is to just make it through the day using nothing but Red Bull and 5 hour energy, and just try to make it home so that he can be with his wife and kid. But even when he's home with his wife and kid, all he's thinking about is all the stuff that he saw throughout the day. And I asked him, like, when was the last time you took some, practice of mindfulness, did some yoga, right? Maybe got into some sort of physical movement, took some time for yourself. And the response is, I don't have time for that, right? I got to be out there. I got to be doing this mission. I got to be stuck in this, right? So I really think that opening up some of those conversations, even though there's going to be some resistance, I would assume, is important to really encourage, right? And just really start to, yeah, just encourage more and more.
Yeah, I just looked up some of the statistics while you were talking, and um, as of 2022, it's an average of 17.6 U.S. Veterans die by suicide each day,
Hmm.
and of that, approximately 60% of veteran suicide occurred among those who are not recent users of the VA or other mental health services. So that just goes to show you the importance of these interventions and how they significantly reduce the risk if they're implemented appropriately. And I think that brings back to your point, proactive and reactive, right? Again, I keep bringing in TV shows. I watch a lot of TV shows, but I've watched the Terminal List, and there's a second season. I don't know if anybody's watched that. If you
Oh
have,
yeah.
it's about Navy SEALs and special forces and special operations and all of these things that they go through. And it's just we got to get it done. And this current season is all about going back to be a civilian, but can these people ever really make it as a civilian? And the whole kind of conversation of the last episode was you won't live a normal life as a civilian. And that's kind of like also, that's not a good way to look at things because there are ways to live a normal life as a civilian as long as those interventions happen proactively. And how do we change that? I don't have the answer for that. But
I think a piece of it is really redefining what your mission is, right? Even though I wasn't in the military myself, I was very blessed to have an uncle that was in the Marines that taught me a lot about military culture, right? And so it's something that I have a lot of interest in and do a lot of research into. It's just, it's just something that I find interesting, right? But when you think about it, when you're a mission driven individual, right, and you're deployed or you're in the service, right, the mission is given to you, right? But then when you transition out of that and you get back into daily life, well, what is your current mission now? Right? How can we redefine the idea of what your mission is, right? But also being mindful along that path, right? Is my mission to be a provider? Okay, great. But what are the strengths and what are the things that you need to really be in tune with to be an effective soldier, to be an effective unit, if you will, right? Even just finding throughout your own community. It's so interesting then, and I'm glad that you found that statistic, because it's just an insane amount of people that are, committing suicide, and ultimately all they really need to do is just reach out to somebody in their unit, right? I mean, they didn't experience this stuff alone. Right? And so really just encouraging these conversations. I know I've repeated it a lot, but it's really, really important. Encourage the conversations, right? Open up those pathways. Understand that it's not weakness, it's strength.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we've hit on the points that we have here for learning objectives. How about we can open up to participants if anyone has any questions or comments about this topic or for Michael. And you can feel free to take yourself off mute or type that in the chat.
Or even any patterns that anybody is seeing, in their own practice and things like that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that as well. Some of your own experiences, and some of the things that, maybe you've been running into as well.
We have a
Okay, so
question here
yeah. Do
that
you
says,
encourage, facilitate groups with the men you work with? Not yet, but that is something that I definitely want to start doing. What I have been doing is I have been very involved with my friend and martial arts instructor, Shahar, and he and I have been putting together a traveling workshop that tries to bridge the gap between movement, martial arts, and therapeutic modalities. And it's been really effective, and that attracts a lot of males, especially who have interest in MMA, things along those lines. But really incorporating on top of that therapeutic conversation and lecture afterwards, to really try to bridge some of those gaps. It's something that I'm passionate in, something he's passionate in, and really starts to attract the population and open up the conversation in a gender neutral setting, right? It's not specifically for males, but everybody is welcome to them. But to answer your question, Courtney, yes, it's something that I am interested in doing more specifically for the male population. Just have not gotten a chance to put the moves into that yet.
I absolutely love that idea, and it's so unique. There are so many people, especially men in law enforcement, who do jujitsu, MMA, um, and it is a wonderful outlet. But to combine that with the emotional part, it can be so unbelievably healing. I think that's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really, really fun so far.
I
Uh,
wanted
yeah, go ahead, Nina.
I wanted to thank you, Michael. This has been really, really educational. And I wanted to ask a question, and have another anecdote from a personal, or not a personal, but a therapeutic interaction I recently had. um, where one of my clients, her partner was in law enforcement, and you could see the devolving of the relationship due to trauma that this person had experienced. And so my question, and it was just heartbreaking. And my question to you, Michael, is if you had that magic wand, how would you begin to approach these individuals where on from my side it felt like, okay, get therapy. There's so much potential and possibility, and yet that felt totally inaccessible for
Mhm.
him. I'm
I think
curious.
my magic wand when it comes to that, if I could have it any other way, would be that they open up to people within their own social circle that have had similar experiences. If they can start the conversation offline without necessarily, I mean, therapy can definitely help, but again, 90% of therapy is done outside of the office, right? So if they can really start to remove some of the barriers that they have and find the people that they can relate to, I think that that can be a really, really powerful thing, building your community, right? Because if somebody's in law enforcement, they're coming in to see me who hasn't been in law enforcement. I guess one of the questions is, well, how is he going to be able to relate to the things that I've been through? He doesn't know. He hasn't been out there, right? But there's people in his circle that have been, right? So I would really encourage the conversation offline and really be able to try to reduce the stigma of even just opening up to your friends about your experiences.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
actually have a question for you, Michael, as
Mhm.
well. This is something that I think isn't talked about enough, and I don't know if you see this in your practice or if anybody here does, but men who were or are in abusive relationships. I think that is when we talk about stigma, we can talk for hours about that, but um, I think that's something that is not at all talked about. When we talk about domestic violence and we talk about abuse, we automatically think of women. And there's all these resources, again, not enough, but there's all these resources for women and children. But there are men who suffer greatly from that. And I don't know if whether there's a message you have or you have dealt with that in your practice, but I think that's also important to touch on because it is just I'm going to protect privacy, but in my own personal life, I know um, someone in my life who has experienced that, and it until they got out of that situation, they didn't even understand that what they went through was abuse.
Yeah, and talk about disclosure and things along those lines. I actually was in one of those situations myself. As I was going through college, I was in a domestic violence relationship where I was the one, kind of on the receiving end of that. And you're right, it's not talked about a lot, and you don't recognize what it is until you're on the other side of it, because there's a lot of shame that's involved. There's a lot of self-esteem issues that are involved. But I think you're right, really opening up the conversation to understand, it's not just a one gender thing. A lot of people, I mean, anybody can experience any form of domestic violence, right? And so reducing the shame around that and normalizing that, can really be a powerful thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Looks like a couple more questions here. How do you get the word out about male therapy so men know it's available? Well, I think Lindsay brought up a really good point with social media, right? Again, I think that conversations for sure, either within your own personal circle or even putting it out online, can make it more accessible and understanding. I'm just now starting the social media journey myself. I was resistant to it for the longest time, but I think it's really important to do. So, really just letting people know that there's male therapists out there, there's female therapists out there that are educated in this, right? It doesn't need to be a scary situation. It can really be something that can be engaging and borderline fun at sometimes, right? Again, it doesn't have to be so rigid. You can make it fun in certain ways.
And also things like this, right? What we're doing today, and
Mhm.
not, there's many people here who aren't in the, I don't know many people, but there's people that watch and who sign up for our webinar who aren't in the necessarily the helping profession. So I think being able to have these conversations and have it be open to, yes, people who want to continue their education, but also just the normal human who wants to learn about this. And I think whether we like it or not, to your point, Michael, social media is here to stay. It's here, it's not going anywhere. And
Yep.
so we lean in or we resist. And that's another conversation. And that's a balance that everybody has to strike for themselves. But I think if it can be used, there's all these corners of the internet. There's all these corners of TikTok there, and some corners are really, really meaningful and really change lives. And um, even for me, self-disclosure, ketamine assisted therapy, that's how, when I started my journey and my healing as a therapist, I didn't know really anything about it. I heard one patient in the ER setting talk about it, went on social media, started to learn about it, and it ultimately changed my life by doing that treatment.
Mhm.
Had it not been for social media, Reddit, I don't know if I would have gotten that type of help that I needed. So I think it's important.
Yeah, I'd agree with you 100% on that. Really, anything that we can do and utilize as tools to get the word out there that there are people out there that want to help, people out there that want to listen, people out there that, do experiment with various forms of, treatment. I agree. I mean, the ketamine assisted psychotherapy has been, fantastic. I've seen some really great results with that as well. I have a guy that I'm working with right now that pretty much erased his anxiety after one dosing session. It's incredible stuff, but you're right. There's a lot of information out there, and the more accessible we can make it, the better results we'll see.
Yes, so to that point, Michael, how can people find you? If someone wants to reach out to you, schedule an appointment, learn more about your practice?
Yeah, well, so I can definitely provide my contact information. Right here, I'm contracted with Integrative Counsel, which who Dana, thankfully helps run. So, I can definitely provide contact information. I don't know if there's like show notes or things along those lines that I can include. Any sort of emails, phone numbers, things along those lines. Yeah, I do this because I genuinely enjoy doing it. I'm open to seeing whoever wants to be seen. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to provide that information.
And Michael, you are licensed in Florida, correct?
Yes, yes, I am licensed in Florida.
Okay. Awesome.
Any last thoughts, questions, anything that you want to add before we start to wrap up today?
It's been fantastic. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. I always love having these conversations. Meredith, Lindsay, I think you guys are doing a fantastic thing with this, with this setup, and I'm really, really hoping for the success for both of you. And I look forward to following up on everything else that you guys are doing. I think it's really important, just as we said, to get the word out there any way that we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot, and hopefully you guys watching and whoever is watching learns a lot and continues to follow us as we talk about all different types of healing and interventions.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. And we'll be sending out information over the next couple of days about our next episode.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All
Take care,
right,
everybody. Thank you
everyone.
again.
Bye.
Bye.